provision, promotion, protection, and prevention to inform inclusive green finance policy development. Our Inclusive Green Finance Working Group now includes 60 members from more than 50 countries, and to date we have seen a total of 10 policy changes on inclusive green finance, 13 Maya Declaration commitments, and several in-country implementation projects already underway. In September 2022, we updated and recommitted to the Sharm el-Sheikh Accord on inclusive green finance. And together with our partners, our work on inclusive green finance is bringing real impact and improved livelihoods to the most vulnerable. By strengthening those that are most vulnerable, we are building more inclusive and resilient financial systems. Join us.
Ladies and gentlemen, we congratulate them also on updating the Sharm el-Sheikh Accord on inclusive green finance yesterday. Please, a big round of applause. This is one, of course, the youngest policy areas in AFI, but one that is quickly gaining traction and progressing rapidly. And it's also a great way to introduce our next session, which is Plenary 2, the Financial Inclusion in the Post-Pandemic World, Emerging Policy Priorities and Pathways, because some of our panel members that we'll hear from in this next session will also speak to what we've just seen as well. So this is a great way to introduce this next session. Ladies and gentlemen, for this plenary session, I would like to hand the microphone over to a young man that many of you know as well, and we've met a number of times at these very forums. So we're very, very happy to have him here to introduce our panel members and also to moderate that session. Let's put our hands together for the lead financial sector specialist, a CGAB. He's none other than Mr. Michael Tarazi, everyone.
Wow, what a pleasure to be off mute after 3 years. It is just terrific to see you all. I'm sure many of you share my happiness in being able to see old friends, to make new friends, and to continue to strengthen this very important alliance for financial inclusion. The panel this morning is an important one on sort of the post-pandemic world, and I'd like to invite our panelists on stage right now. We'll start with the Governor Al-Sharkas from the Central Bank of Jordan, Governor Enari from the Central Bank of Samoa, if you could please join me on stage, Deputy Governor Bijewe from the Central Bank of Kenya, Salim Ergoz from MasterCard, and Laura Foski from ADA Luxembourg. If you could please join me on stage for the panel, I appreciate it. Why don't you... Let me start with Mohammed Amaira, who informs me that the Governor Al-Sharkas won't be able to join us for the panel. Some last-minute important issues came up, but I want to start with you. First of all, thank you and the Central Bank of Jordan team for hosting us. It's a pleasure to be here in your beautiful country. I want to talk to you about your experience under COVID and what recommendations you might have for other regulators, because the conventional wisdom is digital financial services was perfect because people couldn't get together, and so this pandemic was actually great for financial inclusion because it forced people into the digital world. Was that your experience in Jordan? And if so, what lessons do you have for other regulators based on COVID in Jordan?
Thank you so much. Welcome all of you to Jordan to this very fruitful conference, and would like to thank AFI for organizing this forum in Jordan. I think the pandemic as we know all, had a negative impact on all the economic sectors and individuals. That's why one of the most important messages that I want to deliver is the collaboration between public and private sector. I think the collaboration between public and private sector and other stakeholders is crucial and essential for reducing the impact of any crisis. That's why in Jordan, during the pandemic, we had a very comprehensive collaboration between the government and between the Central Bank of Jordan and the financial sector in general and the civil society organizations. So one hand cannot clap. So I think very important to enhance the coordination, to work as one team in order to reduce the impact of any crisis in the future. Also, I think one of the most important messages that we noticed, and I think all over the world noticed it, that the importance of digital financial services and financial technology. I think digital financial services proved to be very effective tools to ensure the continuation of the work, to ensure that money transfers will continue to the low-income people. So investing in the digital financial services and financial technology in general is very important. I think also we have to be prepared all the time. We have to have maybe a strong financial and technical infrastructure. So investing in the infrastructure through the partnership between the public sector and private sector is essential in dealing with any crisis. One thing also I want to emphasize on that, the crisis maybe give signals in how to create a balance between supporting the economy and reducing the impact of the crisis on it, and between preserving and maintaining the financial stability. So this is very important, how to balance between these two goals, to still have a solid financial system and also to reduce the impact and continue supporting the economy. So I think these messages are very important and one of the most important lessons learned during the pandemic.
Okay, so let me just recap. The importance of public-private partnerships, the importance of digital infrastructure, which I assume will be something you're going to invest in going forward, and then the connection. And it's interesting because I know we'll hear from the private sector in just a moment about your feelings and lessons, and then of course the importance of understanding the balance between the micro and the macro on the economic policy. And I think we're going to hear more from our colleagues on that. But let me move from Jordan, a country of 10 million people that is largely landlocked, to a small island nation in Samoa, which is not landlocked, with about 200,000 population. What was your experience, Governor Inari, in Samoa during COVID, and what key messages do you have for fellow regulators?
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm from a country of 200,000 people for the last so many. have been quite resilient in the face of the pandemic. In fact, it's one of a few bright spots and since we encountered COVID-19. The lockdowns and the need for social distancing has pushed to the fore the value of going digital. So with remittances, this is evident in a strong pickup in remittances sent via electronic money transfer operators. For information, 80 to 85% of remittances to Samoa are channeled through money transfer operators. So mobile money is already available in the country, but we need to scale up its usage. I think I've been emphasizing digital financial services and remittances, but the same goes with government financial assistance in times of crisis to be more effectively and efficiently dispersed. So we have had instances during lockdown and quarantine that people had to jump over the fence to go and get access cash from ATM or from money transfer operators. But since November 2020, only 2.7% of remittances came through electronic money transfer operators, but now in February, it's now gone up to 18%. So that is it's a welcome move, and as regulators, again, we need to be mindful of the risks to stability and integrity, and if we try to aggressively push for digital financial services in times of crisis, without proper safeguards, we need to be mindful of that. At the same time, efforts to push the increase of use of digital financial services should avoid increasing existing divides across users. So, of course, going hand in hand with digital financial services is the work on financial literacy so that people can meaningfully use digital financial services. I'll just stop there for now, Michael.
Let me ask a quick follow-up. My understanding was in Samoa, one of the mistakes you made early on was you didn't declare financial services an essential service. Is that right? And I don't know how many countries also would look at that as a mistake that their country made, but did you declare financial services an essential services, and did it stay open, and what was the impact of that?
Yes, that was, but with previous crisis, it never was an issue. But with this one, during lockdowns, the financial services sector couldn't move around because you need to be authorized to move around to provide the service. So that is one important thing that we find out, that financial services should be part of essential services.
So that would be one of your recommendations to others, is to make sure that that doesn't get overlooked in the future. Let me go to Kenya, Deputy Governor Bjewe. We look at Kenya, I'm sure it's not a surprise to you, as a leader, particularly in the digital financial services, financial inclusion space. And so the assumption would be that you fared much better during the COVID crisis because you had the digital rails in place, because people were already used to it. Is that true? And if so, what lessons do you have from the Kenyan experience for your fellow regulators?
Thank you for having us here today, and thank you to Jordan for this great occasion. We're very happy to be here. Kenya is a country of 50 million people, and right now we have 28 million active mobile users, which is about 84% of our population, and the gender gap is 4% between men and women. So really, digital services are a way of life. It's our DNA. In fact, I think in the original days in 2007 when we started this journey, what we found is it was the lower income group that were using digital services. But I think today it's everybody, right to the top, and all ages. I've never really understood why you can find a lady of 80 in a village in Kenya quite happily sending money on digital services. There seems to be something. There was no literacy, there was no learning. They just appreciated the value of the service. Obviously, when COVID came, we realized the importance of the service. And I think the most important thing was that we were able to distribute to vulnerable groups within 4 days of announcing that COVID had arrived in Kenya. So this was an immediate benefit. Obviously, the population, we have a very high uptake of phones, of high quality phones. So you can reach everybody really in Kenya on the mobile. I think as we go forward, the lessons that we're learning is now that you've got this service, now that it's integrated well within the population, how do you use it to the best of its ability? People are using fancy terms of financial health, but I think this is very important. How do we make sure it's being used for good, and how do we make sure it's being improved for good, which includes affordability, accessibility, etc. I think another thing that also concerns us a lot is what does this mean to us from the cyber perspective, and do we have the right infrastructure to protect this system that's become very important to our financial system? Thank you.
Follow up a little bit on this question of cybersecurity, and I think a lot of the regulators in this room are very concerned about that because it's sort of the new consumer protection field. What are you experiencing? What have you seen in Kenya? Because people look to you as what they might expect to see later on, and how have you addressed them?
I think firstly I'd like to say that it didn't come to us in cyber. It came to us in a different way. Kenya is a fairly traditional country, and gambling was not something that we did. But the uniqueness of this system and the ease in which you can use it, the gambling vice picked up very quickly. And so we had to bring in new laws and new taxes to make sure that we controlled. So it doesn't necessarily come in cyber. Cyber really comes down to a circle of trust, because to share cyber data, to share this type of information, you need to get a circle of trust. And I think as a whole in the world, that journey is ongoing. But certainly at the Central Bank of Kenya, we integrate and relate and discuss with the security services of the government of Kenya.
It is interesting. I want to stay on this question of consumer protection, because you raise this question of gambling is not really fraud, right? It's not. It's just something that is a vice that you'd rather discourage. How did you address that in Kenya when you discovered online gambling or mobile phone gambling?
Yeah, what we found is that I think to begin with, you have to then decide where gambling sits. And I think what we agreed is that gambling sits with alcohol. So adults can do it in a structured way, but we shouldn't encourage the youth to be involved in it. And so by introducing the taxes and introducing certain controls within the mobile system, we're starting to control that.
All right, so primarily by taxing it a bit out of existence. Interesting. Let me move to the private sector. Salim Ergoz from MasterCard. I mean, a number of the panelists have talked about the importance of working with the private sector. You have a vantage point that goes beyond any particular country. So tell me what you've seen from the private sector in terms of how COVID impacted financial services and what lessons you might have for regulators.
Thank you. First of all, thanks to AFI and Jordan for hosting us in beautiful Jordan. This is my first time, and I'll come back. I think...
Salim, can I ask you to get a bit closer? Because I can barely hear you, so I'm guessing they can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
So, yeah.
As His Excellency Dr. Adel mentioned, sustainable and inclusive growth is very important, and it's our cornerstone for our strategy at MasterCard. Now, COVID has been terrible for all of us. Nobody, we suffered 2 to 3 years. It seems to be over, fingers crossed. We learned a lot of lessons during this time, and we also have seen a dramatic shift in the payments industry where we operated. We are one of the largest payments technology companies in the world. For example, e-commerce have grown 30 to 40% year on year and keeps growing. It was not so fast before COVID. It was already on the agenda, but it was not growing so fast, sorry. The cyber issues come along with that, obviously. We have seen in this region about 20% of people using less cash year on year. we are seeing 85% of people in our survey, in the payment survey that we have published, being aware of new digital methods of interacting with the broader financial ecosystem. And in the examples we have seen in the Central Bank of Jordan case studies, this is exactly what's happening now, right? So we have obviously the younger segments adopting very quickly to these new trends, and the other segments learning from the younger segments. And I think this trend is accelerating today. That's probably one of the things that COVID has left us with. We also see behavior change. For example, people used to prepay their bookings and everything to get advantage of lower costs, but now we are seeing people are unsure. They may book travel, but they want to pay in the hotel, they want to pay the destination, because things can change at the last minute. It has done many times in the last couple of years. But I think this digital and financial adoption, inclusion is now unstoppable. Humbly, I may suggest that we are working with a lot of governments. We actually just have a project in Kenya to digitize the national parks that would benefit the SMEs as well as the government to optimize those payments in those parks. As an example, we have many such examples, but I think in every country, the government is one of the largest businesses / collection and disbursement of flow centers. Government is a big center of flows, in and out. I think given that this digitalization is happening, the first humble suggestion I would have is for the governments in this region to work with the private sector participants like ourselves to continue to address their own flows as well, inflows as well as outflows, disbursements. Just one example, recently Pakistan had terrible floods. Unfortunately, many people lost their lives and livelihoods. Within a couple of days, we could put a platform working with the government that collects funds to be dispersed to those impacted societies, and this happened very fast. This happened with local partners, with local fintechs. We are just really an orchestrator. We are not even playing a major role. But I think in such a use case or in other use cases where government is actually in the middle of transaction, for example, transit, which usually in this region belongs to the government entities, utilities, we would like to work with you to kind of continuing this digitalization journey in these big sectors. The second one, again, humbly, is there are a number of policy implications of this new world. Obviously, cyber is one aspect, protection of the ecosystem is another aspect. We are very interested in developing policies together with the government entities, municipalities, to ensure that the ecosystem grows healthily. And as more people are included into the financial ecosystem, that they can also benefit from it. It's not a one-off. It is sustainable in the sense that there's a behavior embedded into that inclusion, working together on a safe, secure manner so that trust can be built over a period of time, and this becomes really sustainable for all the participants in the ecosystem.
Thank you. So the two messages for regulators, one is you are active participants in the digital system by G2P payments and P2G payments. You can actually induce, take up of the digital rails. The second, if I understood, was something a little bit less definitive, more about let's all talk together about cybersecurity. But I want to talk to you a bit more about that. I could argue if I'm using MasterCard as my primary rails for, payments, it's your responsibility to deal with the cybersecurity, not necessarily mine. How do you view that approach in terms of primary responsibility for cybersecurity?
I think we as an organization, first of all, have a lot of learnings from this space, being a target for bad actors on a daily basis. That's the reality. That's the reality of because again, we have about 3 billion cardholders globally, processing trillions of transactions. You can imagine, even before COVID, we were watching a lot of, creating a lot of awareness of this space. I think the responsibility is with us, with the government entities, with policymakers, to watch the space, identify, utilize the tools that we already have to identify these bad actors and to basically go after them. So, I mean, it's actually quite straightforward, and the tools are available. It's continuously being developed, and many companies like ourselves are embedding these tools into the payment system automatically. So, in the background, you know, anecdotally, I just want to say something. When my first jobs in a large bank, the head of data center was presenting, and the gentleman who was head of the region said, "We don't want to hear from you." And everybody was shocked, like, what do we want? We want to hear from your presentation, but you need to operate so smoothly. We should not know that you exist in the sense that, right? So we are trying to ensure that all these, let's say, negativities, let's say, the safety is embedded so much into the payment transaction. You don't really hear these negativities, there's these threats, and we shield the system from all these threats. That's, I guess, a good way of addressing it.
Thank you. Let me move to Laura from ADA in Luxembourg. You've done a lot of research in the microfinance space over very many years. What, from your perspective, changed with COVID, and what lessons would you have for regulators in the room?
Can you? Yeah. Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for the invitation. It's a privilege and an honor for me to be here in face of this strategic and political audience. I'm used to work in the field in a bottom-up approach, and I think that one of the lessons learned, as the speaker previously mentioned, is this public-private partnership that is one of the key messages and the key lessons learned during the pandemic, because all of us cooperated to promote and to save also the financial inclusion system. Yes, despite all the difficulties and the sufferings, as it has been mentioned this morning, we learned a lot from pandemic. And if I have to choose one key insight from this learning, I would choose the importance of savings for vulnerable people. We as in ADA support microfinance sector as part of the inclusive finance sector. So we support with financing and also with capacity building financial service providers that have as clients the most vulnerable people. And we realized with our study into 2020 and 2021, studies that we realized with surveys to the direct final customer, the clients of the final clients, the beneficiaries of these microfinance institutions. And 80%, 70 to 80% of the people that were interviewed considered the savings as the first action, the first line of defense during the pandemic. And I think this is an evidence today, but is really important for the resilience of vulnerable people in several countries. And a message maybe for the regulator is the fact that there are not only banks that are able to provide savings products to vulnerable people, but there are also other kind of financial service providers, specialized one, like for example, SACCOs that are close and in a proximity with vulnerable people, fintechs as well that can improve their way to reach vulnerable people in order to having access and to use adapted savings products. Yeah, if I another point is really to help microfinance institutions to be reinforced and to be more solid, because during the pandemic this was the change and what changed actually the sector in financial inclusion for us.
I want to go back to a bigger question of sort of going forward. We still have very vulnerable populations. Who are those vulnerable populations in your countries, and what are you going to do to sort of address those populations? We typically talk about women, we typically talk about the rural, we talk about youth. How does it work in your country, Governor Inari? Let me start with you, just to hear a little bit, because you say, look, women are not your issue. The gender gap is 2%, and that's actually men who are less included than women. So women is not something you focus on, but who do you focus on, and how do you address it?
Thank you, Michael. Well, there are competing priorities, but gender is not a concern. It's not a burning concern. I just want to state some statistics. We did our financial services demand side survey in 2015, and it shows that Samoan women are faring well in financial services, that there is a high proportion of women who are financially included in comparison to men. 66% of adults have some form of financial products and services, and in terms of gender breakdown, there are 40% of women who have a bank account when compared to 38% of men. Similarly, 13% of women also use other formal financial services in comparison to 11% of men, and 17% of women access informal financial services in comparison to 12% of men. So, if anything, the statistics are very telling that we should empower men in my country. But, so while gender is not a burning Well, gender is not a burning concern, but we keep an eye on it to ensure that it doesn't deteriorate further. So digitization is a cross-cutting theme across all priorities and goals, but as a small island state, we are prone to natural disasters, and climate resilience is paramount to our survival and many livelihoods.
And how far, I mean, climate, of course, everyone is talking about climate right now. But what exactly are you doing? What are you thinking about in terms of how you address climate change in the context of your country, Governor?
There is work in the region that we hope to pick up on. It's the inclusive green finance and also the work in the region in the insurance space. So our journey in inclusive green finance is still at its early stages, and in promoting that, as regulators, we need to assess and integrate climate-related risks as part of our supervisory framework.
Thank you. Let's go to Jordan. Who are your vulnerable populations in Jordan, and how are you targeting reaching them?
Thank you so much. I think it's a very good question. And really, before launching the financial inclusion strategy in 2017, we conducted a diagnostic study in order to be able to put our priorities and to identify the most vulnerable groups in the country in order to be able to serve them and to provide them with fair and responsible financial services. I think in Jordan still youth and women are vulnerable groups.
Who and women? Women and somebody? Rural women? What did you? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Rural women.
Yes, especially when we're talking about women in rural areas. Still there is a gap in providing the financial services to this segment. Youth, especially the entrepreneurs that would like to create their own business. I think also this is a vulnerable group that we have to focus on. And I think MSMEs in general. Yani, okay, the SME sector in Jordan represent more than 95% of the companies operating in Jordan, but I think still a high financing gap. We have to work on it. Okay, we made great progress in this regard, but at the same time we need to do more, especially by providing capacity building programs and technical assistance to provide them with the skills needed, how to start the business, how to develop the business, how to expand it, how to be bankable, how to meet the requirements of banks and financial institutions. That's why when we are talking about women, youth, especially in the rural areas, and SMEs are still vulnerable groups, and a lot of progress and efforts have been made in Jordan, but I think through the implementation of the new strategy. Now we are working a new financial inclusion strategy, and this strategy also put a very well-defined priorities with clear measures and actions to be taken to improve financial inclusion to the vulnerable groups, especially through investing more and more in the financial technology, because financial technology and digital financial services enable us to reach out the vulnerable groups, especially in the remote areas. So since the implementation of the first strategy, we noticed a good progress in this regard, but now we are working a new strategy, and under the new strategy, we will make sure to improve financial inclusion for the vulnerable groups.
Thank you. Interesting, you point to youth. I know the MasterCard Foundation's sole strategy is around youth in Africa, but I know the Arab world also probably has a youth bulge that might need to be addressed. I want to go to Kenya, and I purposely kept you last, Deputy Governor Bijewe, for this question, because some might argue, and even as you've pointed out, your numbers are very good, and some might say your issue is not inclusion anymore. You know, it's really not about, you know, getting people access. You've kind of got them the access. You're working on the quality. You're way ahead of many of your colleagues, not just in Africa, but even in the United States. I remember a friend of mine who worked with the US government said, yes, at the beginning of COVID, we looked at Kenya to see what they were doing because we were not as set up as Kenya was. Is Kenya moving to sort of a post-inclusion world? Is your agenda more on what our colleague from Jordan mentioned, more of the macroeconomic, understanding the bigger picture? How are you viewing this given Kenya's advanced stages of inclusion?
Yeah, I think that, as I say, we've ticked the box of access. If you've got 28 million active users on a 50 million population of a large number of youth in that population, then you've ticked the box of access. But access it's not the end of the story, because then you're talking about how it's being used and how successful it's being used and how fairly it's being used. I wanted actually to get on to the green agenda, because I think that's where we're really looking very seriously at the moment. You know, all of this is an infrastructure. When you're talking geopolitics, when you're talking about the climate, when you're talking about resilience or digitization, it's all connected. And you have to have the whole infrastructure in place for the success of the digitization to continue. For example, if a woman is hit by some kind of climate event, then her digitization is also impacted. Her financial and her economic security is also impacted. So in Kenya, we've been working hard to put together this whole infrastructure. And to be honest, I didn't understand how well it had been put together until I did my work for this session, because I wanted to be clear. But in our constitution, we have written into that the Paris Agreement. So we have a clause in our constitution about the necessity to be a green nation. We have a 30% reduction in our emissions by 2030 objective. We have a Climate Change Act 2016 written into our law and now being implemented. We have renewable energy. Currently, we're 86% renewable and 90% renewable on electricity. And this is mainly through geothermal. We're the 8th largest geothermal producer in the world today. I think that 7.4% of our country is forest covered, and we've also banned plastic bags in 2017. I noticed, you know, when you go to an airport now, and in fact I have to say that we followed Rwanda. They were the first to ban the plastic bags. And if you go to an airport today and you see people removing plastic bags from their shopping, they're going to East Africa because we have banned them. You're not allowed them. It's illegal to have a plastic bag. When we look at the financial sector, what have we done? Climate risk is built into our internal capital adequacy and assessment processes. So now banks have to, when they give us their reports, they have to report on climate risk. Kenya's sovereign green bond was launched. I have to say, as a small thing, it's not a big deal, but that was launched in 2014. We've also, our Bankers Association has now financial guiding principles, and the Central Bank of Kenya also released a guidance paper on this matter. But I think I want to say something else, which I think is equally important. When I look at the data around carbon emissions, what I see, and where I got this data from, is something called Our World in Data 2019. Africa's emissions are 3.8%. If Kenya does everything, what kind of impact can it have? And therefore, we have to ask the rest of the world, what are you doing? Thank you.
I feel very awkward as an American on this panel, so I will pass on your message. But as you know, we have our own issues there, so I might be moving to Kenya soon. Salim, I'm curious, from your perspective, as how you view either this climate question, which I'm curious about because it's still to me a bit of a vague sort of question around what the role of financial services are, or on the vulnerable populations question, what are you seeing from a private sector perspective?
First of all, again, as our core business is payments technology, we have in the last years, 5 years or so, taken this technology and started to develop certain platforms that we can utilize the learnings from that, and in the agriculture sector, in the healthcare sector, and in the supply chain sector. Just 3 examples, and then I can also maybe talk a little bit about the, I think for the agriculture sector, which is a very important sector, obviously there are a lot of small farmers, and we developed a product called FarmPass that is basically a marketplace for small farmers to connect with each other, because if somebody is not digitally and financially included, you can then only sell in person, right? If somebody is just basically sees you or somehow knows you beforehand, then it's a limited marketplace. But digital marketplaces gives a much broader domestic or international marketplace to anyone. And in the sense that we have launched this program in India, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda. There are now 1 million small farmers on this. And we also found out that before, they had only 3% access to credit, and now we are bringing banking partners to make available certain credits to these small farmers to grow their business. So that's one. The other one is what we call the Wellness Pass, which is basically, even I don't have digital vaccination passes. I think probably none of us have here. So we have developed a digital vaccination pass. There's nothing to do with payments, but using the technology in payments to be able to include digitally the vaccination records of kids in various countries. This one we are piloting in Mauritania, and I think it's a very nice way of digitally including citizens in a very meaningful manner, because there's follow-ups on vaccinations, the dates are reminded. That's a good thing to take from the payment space and to expand to other spaces. And the third one is actually piloted in Kenya with partnership with Unilever and KCB, where Unilever's distribution network, small shops, can now digitally see there's a connection between them and their supplier for their supply chain. So they can digitize it, and then again, a bank can step in and provide credit to successful businesses. Because if there is no access to credit, the large companies all have access to credit and they have everything, but when it comes to smaller players, that gets more difficult because their business is not transparent to the banking sector. So we are just trying to make those connections. some examples from what we are trying to achieve on other sectors, learning from our learnings. In terms of the MasterCard definitely have sustainability goals as well, but maybe a small example of what I can, before the pandemic, I was meeting with a very honorable minister from Egypt actually, and she told me, Selim, you know, our pensions most of the time are in person, so you have to come to a branch, collect it in person, and that's not very good for the older generation because they have to travel, they have to use the car, it's hot, it's a hot country, and health conditions. So we are working, for example, to digitize those interactions. And even that has a green impact because you want to go and drive for productive means, but you don't want to drive just to make a payment or collect a payment from somewhere. So I think that reduces actually emissions if we use transport less and use it more for really required actions that we take. So it's just one example of how industries are mingled and what we do on the payment space can impact the environment also. So just one example I wanted to mention.
Thank you. Laura, from your perspective, I mean, you have a global perspective on this. How do you decide which vulnerable group you want to target and why?
It was a hard choice to do, because there are several segments of vulnerable people that are worthy. But we choose young entrepreneurship because young entrepreneurs have a strong impact on to address unemployment, to address migration problems, and there is a strong gap between supply and demand of financial services for young people. Actually, financial service providers don't understand the needs of young entrepreneurs because they perceive that too risky. They move too much, too innovative, using too much technologies, and so this risk perception reduce the offer of specific and adapted financial services. So what we are doing is really to reinforce the private sector providing and participating to de-risking financial schemes like guarantee schemes, for example, or national funds that can also provide concessional loans, for example, that can help starting a business from the perspective of young entrepreneurs. I have to say also that financing is not the only need that have young entrepreneurs. They also need, due to the short period that are active in the business market, they need also business skills, they need financial education, and I was surprised and also happy to see for the Global Youth Award that would be awarded tomorrow, a lot of applications that demonstrate that several countries were so committed in providing these facilities to young entrepreneurs, young people in general, and started also financial education programs. And we have seen in our research, because we work in several countries, particularly in Africa, that when young entrepreneurs started very early understanding financial issues, financial matters, are even more able to succeed in their business at the early stage as well. And in some cases, we provide trainings and capacity buildings during all the period of the first loan, and then they became bankable from the formal sector. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wanted to circle back on this question of climate. I'm sorry for going back and forth, but I realized we hadn't heard from Jordan. We heard from our two other regulators on climate, and I'm just wondering, you know, it's no secret that Jordan is in a desert. That desert is actually encroaching on much of your fertile land, so climate is clearly an issue for you here. What's the role of the central bank in addressing these climate issues? Have you thought about that at all? Do you have a plan? Climate change.
Thank you so much. I think this issue is very important. Now we notice that such type of risks are evolving all over the web. So strengthening the climate risk management is one of the most important issues here in Jordan. And now we are working on developing a green finance strategy. The green finance strategy will take into consideration two sides, risks and opportunities. Risks when it comes to strengthening the risk management, when it comes to the climate change related financial risks, how the banking sector and the financial sector can manage such type of risks, how to be able to incorporate them in their credit policies, in their investment policies, in their governance as a whole. So this is a very important issue. At the same time, we have to enhance the green finance. So this is the opportunity side. So taking into consideration the risk side and opportunity side is very important. Now we are working with the World Bank to develop a comprehensive green finance strategy and to conduct something called the climate risk assessment. The climate risk assessment is very important for the country because it identified what the most important types of risks that we have to focus on. We have the fiscal risk and we have the transition risk. So this is a very important, but I think one of the most important challenges in this regard is the availability of data. So filling the data gaps regarding the climate risk management and the green finance activities is one of the most important milestones under our planned strategy. This issue, I think, should be also in line with the national goals and should be part of the big umbrella that we are working on as a financial inclusion strategy. So the overlap and the integration between green finance and financial inclusion is very important to be taken in a way to achieve our goals and to maintain the sustainability. Because provide the digital financial services and the financial services as a whole is very important, but how to ensure the sustainability, how to ensure the responsible and sustainable finance, I think this is the big challenge that all the countries has to work on.
Thank you. I think we have enough time to take questions from the audience if there is any. But while you think of, there is one. Hold on to that. We'll get to you in just a moment. If others of you want to ask, please prepare your questions. But before we get to the audience, I did want to ask just a quick question of the panelists about the role of AFI. And going forward, what do you think is AFI's key role in helping you address some of the challenges you've identified? And let's start with Jordan.
I think the role of the central bank also in collaboration with the financial sector and the government and the private sector as a whole really is to have a very clear and well-defined policies and measures to deal with the challenges. For example, in Jordan in 2012, we started focusing on financial inclusion, and we started by identifying the most important challenges that we are facing. That's why identifying the challenges in a scientific way, this is the first step. After that, how to have collective efforts between the public sector and the private sector to deal with the challenges for advancing and improving financial inclusion. I think having the strategies and policies is very important, but at the same time, the implementation, how to monitor the implementation, how to have a very comprehensive and well-defined monitoring and evaluation. This is very important to have smart goals, to have well-defined KPIs in order to have some building of databases that maybe help you in monitoring and evaluating the implementation of the strategy.
Good. And Governor Ainari, and how do you view AFI's role going forward?
Well, at the very least, there is great knowledge sharing and learning that's already taking place in the Alliance through its public-private dialogues, the capacity building events, and knowledge exchange programs. But I would like to see them more focus on implementation. We have a lot of knowledge products, but we want to see that.
So basically, the knowledge products are not enough. You need to be able to take that and actually apply it and understand from it. Very important. Deputy Governor Bjewe, your views on AFI?
I think it needs to be a convener of events like this so that we can share ideas and get to know each other and understand each other. I think it needs to create a platform that can evaluate and identify risk to financial inclusion. And that platform also needs to coordinate the responses to those risks to make sure that we're mitigating those risks. And most importantly, we should be a voice of the unheard or poorly heard at the international developed institution forums and be a voice, a very loud voice for public good. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Alfred would be very happy to hear that. I think one of his primary motivations in founding the AFI network was to give a voice to those who hadn't been particularly heard. So I think they've been very successful, but of course I leave that to the members to decide. Let's move to the audience. I saw there was a question over there. If you could please identify yourself, and if there's somebody in particular that you're directing the question to, please clarify.
Thank you. Samar from the Central Bank of Pakistan, and my question is to the three regulators, the governors and deputy governors. When the first, and that's related to the subject, when the first round of COVID, hit the world, the stimulus that you have in your toolkit was liquidity that you injected. Inflation rose, and you had to raise the policy rate. And that hurt, those who are the marginal sectors. Now, my question is, God forbid, if the second round hits again, what toolkit would be available with you? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I fully understood. If a second round,
Yeah, then
another disaster comes on top of a disaster.
No, I'm saying if the second round of the COVID comes again, then the problem is that then in order to save the businesses, now you cannot inject liquidity because you have seen the consequences of that. So then what other tools do you have, the central banks have in their toolkit to address so that the business can also continue, and at the same time, you don't create a situation where the inflation goes so up and policy rate has to be raised, and then these sectors are again going to be more marginalized. Thank you.
I think there's very few times when you can be blessed by not having the wealth that other nations have. I think this is one of the times, because if we look and we see what's happening now in America, in Britain, Europe, there's pledges for more intervention. So the outcomes of that will be revealed as time goes by. And obviously, if I speak for Kenya, we never had the extent of intervention. We didn't have the capacity. So we never had the extent of interventions. So we still have some powder in our gun if we need it. Thank you.
Either of you want to take on that question? No. Any other questions from the audience? One way in the corner there. You could please identify yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Stephen from Central Bank of Ghana. My question goes to the Deputy Governor from Kenya. I think, respectively, your last submission really caught my attention on the statement you made that you've asked the banks to do the climate assessment under the Pillar 2, which is the ICAP. My question is that, within Africa, data is a big issue. So what will be your approach? Do you want the banks to focus only on maybe the governance issues and strategy, maybe risk management, or you want them to focus also on quantitative? It's very important for me because to hear this from the high level, I do really appreciate it. So I just wondered if you can really give a bit of maybe more detail a bit. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. We gave a format that we would like to be filled so that there was standardization across the banks in the way that they address it. And we've also allowed them time. We've given them over a year and a half to do it. I think their time ran out in June of this year, so that they had time to work with their auditors who also could assist them. We've done something else, which is still at an initial stage. We've introduced at the central bank an enterprise data warehouse, which is a collection of all data coming in from our financial sector. So they'll also be able to use that. So what I would say is, as time goes by, the quality of that should increase as this data and the accuracy of that data improves. Thank you.
Can I follow up on that? Because this question of climate risk assessment, I think, is a common one among many of the people here, and I know our colleague from Jordan mentioned it. Can you give us a flavor about what exactly you're asking them to report on? For example, each one of their loans, what is the risk that climate would impact the repayment, or is it more than that?
There's different classifications in these risks assessments. And obviously in Kenya we have a certain advantage because we're not a mineral-orientated country. So in many countries that becomes an issue when you're talking about the extractive industry, which we don't have. But what we're looking at more is the weather, particularly in the farming sector, and what are the impacts then that follow through if you get these events happening, and how do you then classify them, and what provisioning have you put in place to protect yourself should one of these events. It's quite technical, but that's the sense of it.
But just to understand that, I mean, this is one of our questions with data that we get all the time, whether it's climate related or not. It's okay, you get the data, but what do you do with it? So if I understood correctly, you get that data and you say, are you provisioning correctly? That's your solution as provision. Is there something else that you do with that data? Do you take more of a global view about the sector as a whole?
Not really, not at this stage, and I think this is what was being asked by the Bank of Ghana, because we're still at that early stage. We're following the guidelines that have come from BIS, which is, at this stage, collect your data, start to see what provisioning is being put. Is the capital adequate for what's required for that business? And if they're going to get into more of that business, they need to be warned that there needs to be more capital to meet the risk that goes with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments on climate risk assessment? Anyone want to comment on that? Yeah, Laura, yeah?
Maybe because this is, I think that you talked about the role of AFI. I think that is really important, the work that the Green Financial Inclusion Group has done. And in particular, there is a role also of harmonization. And when we talk about green finance, I think that taxonomy is really key, because taxonomy clarify the definition of what we are talking about when we talk about green finance, what are the specific green financial products. And there is a very different level of taxonomy today in different countries. In particular, we have seen in South Asian countries where we started a new program funded by the German government in order to improve community resilience through financial inclusion. And we had this framework, that is legal framework, that is really different country to country. And there are some countries that are best in class, that already did this work, but others that there are still in improving and ongoing work. And this harmonization is really important.
Thank you. Yes, from Jordan.
Thank you. I think also when it comes to green finance and the climate risk management, it's very important to have some sort of stress testing in this regard in order to measure the ability of banks and financial institutions to withstand such type of risks. So stress testing is very important in the climate risk management. Also to have something comprehensive regarding ESG, environmental, social governance. All these guidelines are very important to be used to evaluate the borrower, to evaluate the client, to evaluate the sustainability of the project and the ability of the bank and financial institutions to finance such projects. So I think we have when we are talking about financial inclusion and its relation to the climate risk management and green finance, we have to use something related to the holistic or comprehensive approach. We have something called ISEP. ISEP, it's inclusion, stability, integrity, protection. So all these elements, when come together, I think we can reach to something sustainable and in line with the national development goals.
Just for the record, ISEP was established and created by CGAP, and I did not pay you to mention that, but it was a very powerful tool, and I think it's an important one, and I'm happy to hear that you're still using that framework. I think we have time for one more question in the back. I see a couple. Maybe if we can get some quick questions. Oh, now the hands are popping up. Okay, let's start in the back there. I think that was the first one.
Thank you very much. So we've heard a top-down approach.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Johannes Wilms from UNCAP, private sector in DFI, active in Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, and Nigeria. So we've heard about the top-down approach to create resilient interventions and packages for cases of climate risks on businesses or banks. For us, we've actually included collecting data from all the entrepreneurs that apply, all the small businesses, SMEs that apply, and we assess their status of environmental awareness to know how to support them best in preparing them for such cases. So we have to understand how do they view climate resilience, how do they understand that, are they able to save inventory, save cash reserves for such situations that when there is no capacity from banks or other institutions to support them, that they have some resilience as the groundwork to overcome such situations. So understanding what the bottom-up need is and the bottom-up awareness is of such events is also a basic pillar on building resilience at the bottom.
Thank you, but I understand that was not really a question to the...
The question is, are there available education packages or not just funds packages or intervention packages, but also preparing the SMEs for such cases, making them aware of possible risk events in the future.
Okay. So any effort about equipping some of these clients to deal with what might come? Anyone want to comment on that? Laura, yeah?
Yeah, we did in several programs. We provide, we act with an holistic approach in the sense that we start working with communities and providing, I don't want to say training, but information and climate education to communities that are not always aware on their risk and on their capacity to face those risks linked to the climate change effects. And so there are in several programs, but there are most embedded in programs that are granted from different DFIs or governments, is our experience.
Thank you. Okay, I see we've got 2 more minutes, and I saw there was a very eager hand right there in the center. I don't know how we're going to get her a microphone, though. Oh, sorry, more eager hand. She's okay, bear with me. We'll get to you. Two final questions. And if we could, just in the interest of time, it would be as brief as you can.
Yeah, thank you. Mine is really specific. It's from a Central Bank of El Salvador, and it's to Samoa or Jordan. And it's how do you plan or how are you mixing or planning to mix the development of the financial inclusion with the adaptation to climate change? And we ask because in El Salvador, because of our geographic location, we are also very exposed to climate change. And if there is any specific financial products that you are developing or plan to develop. Thank you.
That was to Jordan?
Jordan or Samoa.
Okay.
Thank you.
And sorry, before we jump into that, let me just take that final, the final question, and then maybe we can answer both to conclude. There was a young woman. Yes.
It's Najwa from the Central Bank of Morocco. My question is to all central bankers. Actually, in our developing countries, we are facing a double climate inequality because we are highly vulnerable, but also we have less adaptive capacities and less abilities to really cope with climate-related disasters. So my question, briefly, is how, as a central bank, can we make sure that government bodies and public policies also take into consideration climate-related issues in a balanced way with social and economic priorities, especially that we are having and struggling with other competing priorities in social services, health and education access. Thank you.
I wish those were simpler questions to conclude with. Let me, I think we already talked about climate, but I think the one part from our colleague from El Salvador that I thought was interesting was what specifically, can she start thinking about? Do you have specific ideas for her? And then we can take the other question from Morocco as you see fit. Anyone want to take those on? I know it's a bit daunting. Governor Inari is looking at me like, no. Please don't call on me. Anyone? All right. Okay. With your permission, we can take some of those questions in the hallways during the break afterwards. Aban, I'm losing control here. Do we need to okay. I appreciate that there's a lot more questions. We just don't have enough time to take them. But as I always say, this is just the beginning of a conversation. It's not the end of a conversation. One of the beauties about being off mute is that we can continue these conversations over meals, over coffee, and you can make the connections that you need. I'm sure everybody here is not very busy. They'd love to talk to you and give you any advice that they have. So join me in thanking our colleagues on the panel.